Yeah, so welcome everybody. I'll keep this brief, so you don't have to look at my big face for that long. But my name is Jasper Oosterveld. I live and work in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, for a company called Inspark. And I work as a modern workplace consultant. So I implement the modern workplace, kind of broad, of course, but my focus is around Microsoft Teams in combination with governance. No surprise looking at the session, but also compliance. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP. At the end of the session, I will share my contact details so you know how to reach out. So let's just dive in. So how do you set up a successful governance strategy? Well, we kind of set up a 3-step model, as we like to call it, and feel free to use this with your own customers or within your own company, of course. So what we do first is we start with a governance workshop. Then we define the governance strategy. And last but not least, you also need to implement it. But before I dive into that, what I do always find very important, and I will keep this brief with you guys, but when I talk to customers, I dive a little bit more into Teams, what Teams is and what it can do. And I also do a demo. I won't do the demo now because of the time constraints I have. That will just take too long. But when I would talk to customers, I just show them the basics of Teams, and that'll probably be like 15, 20 minutes. Just how you communicate with chat, how you share files. You can show everything because it'll be a very long session, but just the basics so they get a good basic understanding of what Teams is and what it can do. So I announced Teams as the hub for collaboration communication. And I didn't come up with it myself, of course. So Microsoft promotes it as well, but I do like it. It does really says what it is and what it can do. And it consists out of a couple of pillars. So the first one is chat. And of course, with chat, it's a lot more informal. So I find it a really nice way to communicate because it's also a little bit more fun, right? You can use your giffies, your smileys, and it really promotes an informal culture within a company. And it also saves up email because you don't have to send emails around anymore, at least less, but you can just do it by using chat. Then the next one is, of course, Meet. So you can set up meetings, basically what we're doing now, right? This is sort of a meeting. Everybody can join in. People can share their screens. You can work together, for example, in OneNote, or you can use Whiteboard. So you get a lot more efficient and productive meetings. Now, the next one is calling. This one I don't really discuss because it's not in my field of expertise, because this is really about the call center functionality. So setting up I think it's called PBX. So I'll leave the one out, but it is part of Teams, of course. Next one is collaboration. So being able to collaborate with your colleagues, but also maybe with external people within Teams around documents or maybe around communication materials. And that's, of course, one of the key parts of Teams. And again, it's way more efficient than we maybe used to do it. You had to send maybe attachments, or it was really hard to invite people. And what I noticed, the way we also use it with our customers, is this is a really nice way to communicate with each other and just make everything more efficient. And last but not least, you have the automate part, and that's, of course, the integration of Power Apps and Power Automate to basically create digital processes and integrate them within Teams. So internally, before COVID, we used it to basically ask colleagues if they had lunch, company lunch, and a bot would show up, ask you the question, you said yes or no, and when you said yes, it was automatically deducted from your salary. It's a simple way to integrate a business process within Microsoft Teams. So normally with customers, I dive a little bit more into depth of those pillars, but just for now, I'll just keep it like this. And then I do the demo, and then I basically use this as a summary. So what is the business value of Teams? And that is that you have a central and integrated work experience, right? You work from one application, Teams, and you can work with your calendar. You have your OneDrive for your personal files. You have all your collaboration spaces like the Teams. And what I said, you can integrate business processes. You have Yammer these days. At Ignite, it was announced that there was going to be an app for SharePoint, so you can display your internet homepage. Yeah, so you basically do most of your work within Microsoft Teams. And this is a little bit of a obscure one because it is a bit of a marketing term, but I do find it does increase your productivity because you don't have to switch that much, right? You just stay in one application, and then that helps with your concentration and focus as well. So I do notice that there's definitely an increase in productivity. I do find it hard to pinpoint how much percentage it is, but from personal experience, I do notice that if I do more in Teams, I am more productive. And especially because Teams is a cloud application, a lot of businesses, well, due to COVID, most of us had to do it. But it was a nice way to actually drive digital transformation, right? We're going to the cloud, being able to innovate quicker, having the new features and updates. So Teams definitely helps with that because it's a cloud-based only application service. And last but not least, you're also able to be compliant and secure, and because on one hand your data is in the data centers of Microsoft where it's safe, because if it's not, they can just stop, because that's the whole business model is based at trust. But you also have enough features, and I'll talk about a couple of those, to make sure that once the data is on your devices, you can make sure it is compliant and secure, because that's very important. That is your responsibility. Once data is on your laptop and the laptop gets stolen or people lose it, you cannot complain to Microsoft saying, hey, we lost valuable data. They say like, well, that's really bad to hear, but it's not our responsibility. We give you tools to manage that. So it's very important to make that distinction. So I also ask customers, so you hear me talk about Teams, you see me show Teams. What are some of your worries when you see this? And I noticed that they're basically the same now. I don't really see any new ones. So they're of course afraid for a Teams explosion, that, for example, dozens or hundreds of teams are being created. That there's going to be a lot of duplications. That, for example, there are 5 marketing teams, and to be fair, that is a valid worry, because Teams still doesn't say, hey, there is already a team called marketing. Do you want to use that one, or shall I go ahead and create a new one? It still can be very unclear what the purpose is, especially if it has a name that doesn't really make sense. So then people are confused, like, is this the team I'm supposed to be in, or can I create a new one? Finding teams is still very difficult. I did see at Ignite there's going to be some improvements around the search experience. So hopefully that will be resolved. But for now, it's just not great to find a team that already exists. To be fair, creating a team by using the default experience in Microsoft Teams application can be a bit complex, especially for non-technical people, because it asks you a question: do you want to create it from scratch? No, that kind of makes sense. And you also have the other one, what it exactly says kind of slipped my mind, but it talks about a Microsoft 365 group. Well, they basically lose a lot of people. So it's not the easiest process. It's getting better, but still for some customers, they find it complex. And this, of course, is very relevant these days, is the worries of a data leak, especially because in the demo and introduction, you talk about collaboration with external people. So they are afraid, like, hey, we understand there's a need for external sharing, but we are afraid that data can be leaked, and that's often by accident. So that's a valid worry, so to speak. So let's say you don't address that. It can result in 2 things, and these 2 are very obvious, but I still want to address them. Is that one hand, you can get a failed user adoption because people just get frustrated in the experience. They can't find anything. They don't really understand how it works. And that's a shame, because Teams, when used properly, and it's incredibly valuable for every company. It's not even a company. It can be education, healthcare, whatever. It can be so valuable. And last but not least, it can be really hard for IT, because they can be flooded with questions that maybe could have been prevented if proper governance and also an adoption strategy was set up. So these are basically 2 things you don't want, because then, if there is a negative energy around Teams, that's really a shame, because I think it's a fantastic tool. And I'm not saying it because I have to say that. I really like, since it launched and where we are now, it's unbelievable where we are and where we're going. So next step is, why is governance actually important? And I kind of leave out what governance is, the definition, because it's super long and people start to read it and it's like, it doesn't really mean anything. I think it's more important why you should do governance, why it's important. So on one hand, you have to connect IT and business. Because these are 2 groups of people who often don't really understand from each other what their responsibilities are, because IT want people to collaborate. And I still haven't found an organization where IT was like, no, we don't want that. Like, I have never really seen that. Maybe before my time. But they have other responsibilities that the business is often not aware of. So if you bring them together, there will be more understanding for what each audience is responsible for, right? So they talk with each other, they understand, okay, this is why you always ask these kind of questions. So by setting up a workshop and bringing these but these two audiences together, you will prevent a lot of miscommunication. So that I really highly recommend that. Well, the next one is, of course, adoption. Governance is crucial, but also it's adoption. You cannot do just adoption and no governance and vice versa. You really have to do both. And they basically go hand in hand, because within your governance strategy, certain decisions that impact your adoption strategy, right? And are we allowed to work together with external people? Yes. Okay. How does that work? What are certain responsibilities for example, owners of teams? And there's stuff you have to address in your adoption strategy. Each business, company, whatever, they have internal procedures. So let's say you are not allowed to use third-party apps, for example. Well, if you just introduce Teams, that's turned on by default. So that can lead to unwanted situations. And of course, you also have regulations from, for example, the European Union, right? I live in the Netherlands, so the most famous one, of course, GDPR. How are you going to match that regulation towards the usage of Teams? You really have to look into that, because that can really that can result in a lot of unwanted scenarios where, for example, data or information is being shared in documents or chat that should not have been done at all. And last but not least, Microsoft Teams makes use of Microsoft 365 groups, right? So if I create a team, I don't only get a team, I get a SharePoint team site, planner, still get a group, a stream, Power BI is connected, and I'm probably forgetting a couple more. So that means all this is happening. So on the business, right? Because they have to learn how to work with multiple tools, but also for IT, they need to learn how to manage these multiple services that are all connected to Teams. So again, that's a very important one to understand, and also how do you say it? Use within your strategy. So workshop, step number 1. So there are a couple topics you have to discuss, and we won't dive into each of these because then this will take way too long. So if you have any questions afterhand, just let me know. But you have to define the scope. What is the scope of our governance strategy, right? What are our vision and goals? And this is, you can basically take that one from the adoption strategy, because this will describe why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve? Because that you can use that information to communicate towards your employees, like, okay, we're going to introduce Teams for these reasons, and these will be the benefits. So that will help with the overall adoption and usage of Teams. You need to have a group of people that manage the governance strategy you define and make sure it's followed, and it's also adjusted, because we all know that the world is changing rapidly, and not just technology, but also, you know, other situations like COVID. They will go away one time, hopefully, but something else can happen. So you need to have a group of people who manage the rollout and usage of Teams. So, and that's very important, because otherwise you'll create this document and then we'll just end up in a drawer and nobody checks it anymore. What are some roles and responsibilities? So these are technical roles. So who is, for example, the Office 365 Global Admin, the Teams admin, but also what departments are responsible for the usage and rollout of Teams? Communication department, compliance department. So there's stuff you have to write down as well. So that's also clear for everybody. Okay, these are all the people involved, and they all this person has that role, that department has that role. This is one we'll dive a little bit more into. So, but it's of course the workload for Microsoft Teams, and there's some settings. Then we have processes and procedures, and that's, for example, how you deal with people who enter the company. So how do you make sure they get a license? How do you make sure they are added to the right team? How do you manage when somebody goes to a new department or leaves the company? That's all stuff you have to describe as well. And the last one, new features and updates. Although Microsoft Teams is not part of targeted release or first release, just mix those two up. That's the part where you can assign it to your whole tenant or a couple people, and they will receive new features. Teams is not part of that. Only SharePoint and I believe Exchange and OneDrive, but you do need to manage or somehow anticipate changes. So that's something you really have to address as well. So these are basically the topics we'll dive into around the Microsoft Teams workload. So you need to start with defining templates, because most companies out there, they don't use Teams just for one type of team. They want to use it for collaboration purposes. So these are often the most common ones I see. So for customers, for projects, departments, cross-department collaboration. So you need to sit down with your customer or internally and discuss, okay, how are we going to collaborate with Teams? Please keep it simple and start small. Don't define 10 and set up a governance role 10, pick like 2 or 3. And then after that, you can always extend it with more. So once you've done that, per collaboration template, you need to define other things. For example, naming convention. And this is an example. So what you can do, you can say when a team is created, it needs to have abbreviation and then a dash and then the name of the team. This is an example, right? And then some customers also would like to have a set URL. So for example, if it's a project, it has the abbreviation PROJ dash name of the project. And that's something you can only do still through provisioning, but it is something you have to discuss with your customer internally. Is this something we want? There are a couple of options how to do this. You can use an Azure AD policy where you can use, you can add a word, the word you specify, as a prefix, so before the name or after the name, including an AAD property. So for example, department. I have still never seen this being used out there because it's not really a flexible solution, but I do want to tell you that it does exist. This is the most common one. The most common one is that a provisioning solution is used where the naming policy is automatically applied depending on the template that's been chosen. You can also leave it up to employees if you do more self-service scenario. That is an option. You don't have to do it, right? It's not required. I have an example later on for a customer that actually made sense that they did it, but that's something you'll have to discuss internally if it's really necessary. So what are some advantages and challenges? Some advantages, it does improve definability, because as I said before, finding teams is not easy, right? Still, I hope it's improved soon, but still it's not easy. This can help making it easier to find teams. When it's not added there, it does also help with the management of teams for IT, because if it has a clear naming policy, it helps them to decide, okay, we understand now what these teams are and what they're used for. That said, there are some challenges. What I said, that AAD policy is not flexible at all, and most customers, they don't really always have an up-to-date AAD, or it doesn't really match the way they want to use the collaboration templates. Because you need to have one word, right? And it's hard to find one word that matches all those collaboration templates you defined. If you do a self-service scenario, yeah, people will just forget. I would forget too, because in the same heat of the moment, you just want to have a team, and you're not always going to remember, hey, I have to apply this naming convention that has been set up by the organization. So like I mentioned before, only do it when it's really necessary. So for example, we have like a local district. We share this tenant with multiple other districts and some organizations. For them, they had to do this, because otherwise it was impossible to see to which district or external company the team belonged to. So for their business case, it made completely sense. So next up is external access. So you have a couple options. So with this, I mean, of course, inviting people outside your company to collaborate within Teams. You can allow it for all teams. It's very straightforward. Don't expect anything shocking. You can allow it for a selection of teams, or you can disable it. But these days, you can also decide it with a sensitivity label. And this is one we'll discuss a little bit further down the road. But that's a relatively new one. So there are some advantages by using external access. It will definitely reduce shadow IT, because people, they need to collaborate externally these days a lot. I see it growing per year. So if you don't provide that, people will find a different way. If you think they don't, they will. Please believe me. So you have to facilitate that. And it's just more efficient to collaborate than just sending emails. And it's just so old-fashioned, and it's just not efficient and effective at all. That said, there are some challenges you need to address. So first of all, compliance is crucial, because of course an external person needs to have access. That's one part. But once he or she has access to your team and your files, they can basically do whatever they want. They can download all the files, share it to the whole outside world, because nothing is really preventing that if you don't set anything up. So that's why data classification and DLP, what we'll address a little bit further down the road, is crucial. The owners are the only ones, so a team owner is the only person who can invite an external person. So they have a responsibility, so they need to be aware of that. So that's something you have to accept as well. Like, okay, we accept that our employees who have the role as owner are going to be able to invite external people. So what do I advise? So I would advise to turn it on for all teams, right? Because otherwise people will find a different way. That said, you need to have something in place to manage it, because I see people see this like, oh, that's like very, that's intense. Like, I don't know if we want that. So there are a couple of options you can have to manage it. You can apply a periodic review by using Azure Access Reviews. That does require a more expensive license, but with that you can set up a review policy where you define for these teams each month or 2 months, you basically define it yourself. The owners have to do a review of the membership. So that's not only external people. I believe that you can define that, but you can do all members, and they can just say, okay, access still has to have access, no, and then that person will be automatically removed. You can also create your own solution by using the graph. That works as well. Social control, very important, right? If you're on a team that should not really have external people, you can always ask your other members, like, hey, why do I see all these guests popping up, right? So don't underestimate that part. That can help as well. You have to educate your team owners. Like I said, they're the ones that are able to invite external people. So if you turn it on for all teams, you can teach your owners like, hey, you can invite external people, but for these type of teams, we don't want that. And again, start with compliance. I'll talk more about that later. Next up is expiration policy. So what does that mean? That means that you can define a certain time frame, for example, 90 days, that each team or a selection of teams are checked on activity. So is anything happening? No. The owners will receive an email 30 days before the expiration of those 90 days, asking, do you want to keep the team or do you want to renew it? No, renew is fine. It will be renewed for another 90 days. But if they say no, you can delete it. Everything will be removed to the recycle bin. A little bit more about that later. If they don't respond, 15 days later, again, and then a day before, and then it's automatically removed. So you can assign it to all teams, selection of teams, or none. And this is what you have to match. So everything I discussed now, so the naming policy, expiration policy, external access, and the other stuff that's coming out, match that with the collaboration template you defined in the first step. So again, you don't have to do this. This is not an obligation. What is nice these days is that you have an activity check. So after 65, it checks if there's any activity. So what does that mean? It sees, are any members basically working with documents in SharePoint? It's all list, but that's what it is, right? They're working with documents. Or people are actually opening channels in Teams. If the system notifies, sees that, well, not sees, sees it, sort of, they will automatically renew that team. So the owners won't be bothered with an email. And that's nice, because especially if you turn it on for all teams, yeah, if you get that email every 90 days as an owner of a department team, it's kind of weird, because it's like, yeah, of course I want to renew it. So now they will never receive that email. Okay, next up, advantages and challenges. It does keep your environment clean because unused teams are automatically removed. IT doesn't have to do it manually, it's done automatically. Some challenges are that you do rely on the Microsoft backup. So if a team is removed, everything is removed. Chat, the files, the planner, everything that's connected, and will stay in a recycle bin for 30 days. After those 30 days, it's definitely gone. Responsibility for owners, because they are the ones that have to respond to this message. And I say email, you also see a message in Teams itself. I think it's a little symbol, and it's very clear for owners that they can renew it from within Teams as well. But they have to do it. If they don't do it, eventually it will be done for them. So again, you need to have retention policies set up, and I'll talk about it later as well, to basically prevent the deletion of data that you don't want to be deleted. So my advice, I would just turn it on for a year to start with and see if that's feasible. If it's not, turn it off or make it even shorter, like 6 months, for example. Apply retention policies, more about that later. Next up, restore, backup and restore. So these are the default options from Microsoft. Right? Team is stored for 30 days. Channels are stored for 30 days. Content is stored for 93 days. It's from the SharePoint point of view. Videos are stored for 30 days. And that's basically it, right? And so you need to evaluate or discuss internally, is that for us sufficient? Yes or no? And also match it, of course, to regulations, because again, some data has to be deleted after a certain amount of time. I believe a resume. Let's say it's not 3 months, maybe it is, but I'm not sure. But let's say it's 3 months. Yeah, that has to be deleted. So you have to set something in place to make sure that actually happens. There probably more. I'm not trying to promote AvePoint. I've seen that one. It looks very good. It works well. So that is one of the options you have if the standard from Microsoft is not sufficient for you. But definitely check out. There are probably more vendors. So, but this is the one I've seen. So that's why I included it. And again, you have to work with retention policies. So more about that later. Privacy. So what is the privacy of my team, my collaboration template, right? Do I want it to be private? So that means only the owner can invite people and it's not discoverable by other people. Or is the public team that everybody can become a member? Or is it organization wide? And that will basically add all the employees. Still have never really seen that being used. But that's actually what it does. If I create an org-wide team, I believe they're max of 5, everybody with, let's say I'm working Contoso, with a Contoso license will be automatically added. So what do I advise? I'm always a fan of knowledge sharing, making sure everybody can access everything. I understand, of course, that there's some teams that should not be open, like the team of the board of directors, for example, or HR. I get that, but try to be open by default. And that means open by default, it cannot be open. It's fine, we do it in private. Be aware that owners can change the privacy setting. They cannot do that. It's a bit confusing sentence, but they cannot do it if the team uses a sensitivity label. Because from a label point of view, you can say these teams with this label can only be private. You cannot change it back. But I'll talk a little bit more in a second. It probably make more sense. Oh, here we are. Perfect. So sensitivity labels traditionally have been used to protect data. So I have, for example, this presentation. I can assign it a label called highly confidential. And because I assign a label, only people within InSpark can access it. Well, these labels are now extensible to work with Teams or SharePoint team site or just Microsoft 365 groups in general. So you have a couple options. So let's say I have a label highly confidential. Within that label, I now can say when this label is being used for a team, the privacy is either public or private. The next one is guest access is allowed or it's just blocked. This is a new one. It's still in preview. It was announced during Ignite, but you can now also change the external sharing settings. Anyone, new and existing guest, or none. And the last one is more related to conditional access, is that you can block conditional access in combination with Intune, where you can block unmanaged devices. So let's say I have an unmanaged device, I don't have access to the SharePoint content, or I only have a browser with online access with limited options, or I have the full access. If you want to use this, please discuss it with your colleague or with the person responsible for conditional access and the whole mobile device management and device management in general, because it does impact that part. And there's often already settings at that level. Just because you set the label highly sensitive on a team doesn't mean that all the content is automatically assigned that label as well. Those two things are separate. So what does this look like? So this is just the edit menu of the label. I can say here, I only want to use this label for groups and sites. That's new, actually. You weren't able to do that before. Or I want to use it for both, so files and emails. Then I have the option, I want to do protection settings for groups, where you can do the privacy and external user settings, or the protection settings for sites, the unmanaged devices part. So you see that here. Again, I select the privacy, I select the being able to work with external people. And here I decide how I want to deal with unmanaged devices. As you saw in the slide before, the external sharing, I wasn't available in my tenant yet, but that will be available here as well, where you can define if people are allowed to share externally, like the files in SharePoint, and how. So let's say I have a label called project. I create a new team and I select it. You can see I can only pick private. I can type an external address. It just doesn't work. I would like the message to be a bit more clear that says that there's a policy that doesn't allow you to invite external people, because now it's like, well, am I doing something wrong, or it's just a bit unclear? And this is just an example what it could look like if you're trying to access a file or SharePoint with an unmanaged device. So I find these labels very interesting to use in a self-service scenario. I'm still trying to figure out if you can combine it with provisioning. But if you do a self-service scenario where people can just create teams without any approval or like some other provisioning mechanism, this can be very helpful. But this is something you do have to define in a separate project, because if you do a workshop and you also have to set up a whole data classification project, your project will explode. So I won't advise that, but I do advise to set it up separately in a different project, because it's definitely crucial. Next up is DLP, data loss prevention. Very simple. With data loss prevention, you can prevent the sharing of sensitive information. And that sensitive information can vary from social security numbers, credit card numbers, IBAN numbers, or even sensitive information you define. I says here chat, it's also content actually. So if I have a document with a credit card number, it will work as well with DLP. Yeah. Actually here, know your slides. So what you can do is actually nice. So you can prevent that if somebody uploads a document or adds a chat, and then you define in DLP policy, hey, if somebody does that, it's automatically blocked for an external person. For a DLP and chat, you need an E5 license for some reason. I still don't really know. Well, it's probably an upsell from Microsoft, but it is something you have to be aware of. For content, for the SharePoint, the OneDrive part, the E3 is fine. So again, I included a couple examples, so you kind of have an idea what it looks like. So this is just an example, and this is not a real number, so you can try to use it, but it's not a real one. So this is just a document I create. And then what happens is protected by the DLP policy message, a policy tip, and then the policy tip you can define yourself what it says. So that's what happens you create a Word document in a browser. This is what happens when you upload a document directly into SharePoint, or once you've created a document like the slide before and you go to the SharePoint site. It will show you a little symbol, red symbol. The red symbol's never good, so it's like, oh, hey, something is up. Again, you see the message, and if you click on View Policy Tip, again, you see more of an explanation. So then if somebody's not aware why this is happening, you can help them here. You can also give them the option to override it or report it. And I would definitely recommend using the report, because then you have some more interaction with people if they don't understand why this is happening. And that report can be sent to, for example, to a CISO or somebody else who's in charge of the compliance part. And there's also a whole dashboard where all these DLP policies are triggered are also being displayed. Something for a different session, but that's something you can go over with your CISO or your security compliance responsible people as well. So how does it look like in Teams? Again, I place a chat, in this case, an IBAN number. It's immediately triggered. Immediately it says the message is blocked. A little message pops up in the bottom. And again, I see the same pop-up window with an explanation and the ability to override or report. So I would advise to definitely match your internal procedures, like what information do we use and how are we allowed to share this in relationship to Teams, and are there any regulations like GDPR we also have to implement while using Microsoft Teams. You have to test it. DLP sounds very self-explanatory and easy to implement. It's not always. Like, there are a lot of cases where you expect a policy to be triggered and it doesn't, and vice versa. So there's a lot of testing involved because you can fine-tune the policy. So please do that before you implement this in production. And what you've noticed from the screenshots is, yeah, there is something happening. Like I create a document and it gets blocked. Oh, why is it being blocked? So before you turn it on, please provide communication materials. Add a news item on your homepage for your internet portal, for example, so that people are aware. And again, Tell them why. Why are you doing this and why is it so important, right? And again, set this up as a separate project because it will be too big to implement within the setup of your initial governance strategy for Microsoft Teams. Next up is retention. So retention is also relatively straightforward. It's basically around this, it's the concept of making sure chat or content like documents are retained for a certain period. So that can be an amount of days, months, or years. You can define that. So that means it cannot be edited, for example. But you can also say, I want it to be deleted after a year, for example, like the resume example. I want content with that is a resume to be automatically deleted after 3 months, or just deleted. So you can allow people to make changes, but after a year, it's automatically deleted, right? Still not for chat in private channels. Retention is not supported. It is for content. It's just the chat part. This advice is a copy of DLP. Again, this is something you really have to thoroughly test, so you're 100% sure it actually works, right? So again, I'm not going to go over this again, but this is the same stuff for DLP, applies to retention as well. So I'm just checking sometimes for the time. So next up, now this is probably you're wondering, like, hey, when is he going to talk about like the creation process? And I find that you have to do this last, because all the stuff we just discussed basically decides, can we go for a self-service scenario where everyone is allowed to create a team within the application, so the Windows 10 application or the browser application, or do we need to go to a scenario where this is also allowed, but just for a selection of people? Or do we need to set up a more strict process where somebody has to request it, it has to be approved, and then has to be created by using a provisioning solution? So there's no right or wrong. I often see customers worry like, oh, if we go to this direction, is that bad? If we go to that direction, is that bad? It just really depends on your requirements. I don't think there's a wrong or right here, right? It just depends on your requirements or your customer's requirements. So a couple things. So first of all, yeah, if you want to use multiple collaboration formats like a department or a project, yeah, then you're often forced to be moved into a provisioning solution. Although Microsoft has now released, or is in the process of releasing, Teams templates, where you can define a project team and a department team, and then have some basic settings. So if that's your only requirement, yeah, then you probably don't have to use provisioning, because you can now use the standard functionality provided by Teams. But let's say you have collaboration formats with really strict naming policies, yeah, then you're just bound for now to provisioning. It's the same with strict external access policies. You know, if my advice can be followed, and it can happen, I see it once in a while, yeah, you're basically bound to a provisioning solution that basically sets the external access per type of format, collaboration format. This is the last one. If you have strict expiration policies, it's the same. It's just, that's not going to work with self-service. Well, now you have to go to the Teams settings, because Teams has its own admin center where a lot of settings can be defined that impact all the teams or a selection of teams, or every employee or a selection of employees. I totally forgot to update this slide. I see it now, because this is a huge shame, because we were able to apply a setting where owners could say, hey, I know my team is private, but I still want it to be discoverable. That option is now gone. I believe it's coming back again, but unfortunately it's been turned off. So remove that one. But you can also say, hey, I want everybody to create a private channel, or I just want a selection of people to create a private channel. What are your message policies? So is everybody allowed to edit their own message? Are you going to allow GIFs or memes? Are you going to use read receipts, right? Where you can see if somebody read your message. I hate that, but you can turn it on. Are you allowed to use all Microsoft apps? Are you allowed to use third-party apps, or are you just allowed to use a selection of apps? That's all stuff you have to discuss and then apply. Are you going to be able to use tagging or any third-party file storage, right? If you go in Teams to files, by default, you're able, well, I'm not sure if it's 100% your default, I think it is. You can integrate Box, Dropbox, and a couple other ones. Yeah, there can be scenarios where that's fine, but in most cases it's not. So you have to go over that. So once we've gone over all these topics, and I know it's a lot, but you have to do it. It's crucial to have a successful rollout of Teams and usage and long-term usage of Teams. So what you do, you go over all these topics. You get an agreement. You add them in a document, but it can also be a PowerPoint presentation or a SharePoint page, whatever suits your needs. So I'm not forcing you to use a document. That's still what we're doing. We're going to make the transition to, I think, PowerPoint, but eventually SharePoint pages. I often present these findings or a colleague to the customer. Then we finalize it. There's often a little bit of a review process going on. And then, yeah, eventually you have to implement it. And the implementation are often the settings, right? The app settings, the message policies, but also often a provisioning solution. That's still the most implemented thing I see. It's a provisioning solution that has to be used by using Teams. So again, not right. It's not wrong. It's not right. You know, it really depends on the requirements. But I do think with the introduction of Microsoft Teams templates that it's going to shift a little bit. Yeah, and you need to implement a solution. So that can be your own provisioning solution. But Provision Point has a really good one. But you also, for example, have ShareGate Apricot that's more aimed at a self-service scenario where it provides more control to the owners of Teams. It provides a really nicely interface for IT where they can see all the teams, so they can manage it very easily. So that can be a good solution as well. Or you just use your own solution. Well, I think I did pretty well in time. I was kind of worried I wasn't going to make it. Yeah, I'll go over the questions in the chat in a second. But thanks, of course, for attending. I really appreciate it that you took your time to watch me talk about governance. These are my contact details. I believe the organization is sharing all the slides. So don't worry, you can take a look at this later as well. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Twitter or send me an email. I don't respond immediately in email because I get a lot of emails. So maybe Twitter or LinkedIn is the easiest one. I added a couple resources that I think are relevant connected to this session. Definitely check out a lot of stuff that was announced at Ignite as well. It would be nice if you want to rate my session. Would really appreciate that. So it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, either way. So that was it. So what I will do now, I'll take a quick look at the if there are any questions. So let me move this one here.
Yes,
yeah, I am aware that Spider-Man is doing his silly thing above my head. Yeah. Okay. Well. Yeah. Well, I will just stick around for like 5 minutes, and then
just to jump in here.
Any questions you have, and otherwise reach out to me later. So thanks again for joining me, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Great. There was just one question about can a global admin have oversight on what files have been already uploaded to Teams?